front
Yeah,
of
it's
me.
fine. We've got this session 2 is the games online and at events, and we've got Sam Illingworth talking about the Carbon City Zero card game next.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, so Sam is a senior lecturer in science communication who uses poetry and games to develop dialogues between scientists and other publics. Off you go, Sam.
That's great. Thanks very much, Emma. Thanks everyone for this opportunity to speak. So I'm just going to be talking today about a game that I developed with my colleague Paul Wake called Carbon City Zero, and it's a card-based game that I'll talk about as we go through. So I just want to begin by, kind of asking why tabletop games? Why are we interested in tabletop games? So tabletop games being games that we can play around a table, like card games, board games, role-playing games, etc. And, as I say here, the strength of tabletop games lies in the creation of a safe space in which to engage in discussions of complex and at times contentious topics and enabling people to take control of their own learning. So when we play tabletop games, we basically negotiate a contract with the players that we're playing with, that we can adopt behaviors that we might not normally have away from the gaming table, which in turn can enable us to break down hierarchies that we have away from the gaming table, which in turn can enable us to have dialogues that aren't normally possible. So they create this safe space, which in game studies parlance, we might call the magic circle. And Paul and myself have done a lot of work in playing games. So in going into various different environments, so Blue Dot Music Festival, for example, on the left, where we're playing a game to talk to kids and children about friction. And then on the right, a game that well-known game called Pandemic, which we actually took into schools pre-COVID to talk to them about antimicrobial resistance. So there's a lot of work and a lot of research being done into the fact that games are this great space to start to enable dialogues to take place. And they're just using games like commercial off-the-shelves games. But you can take it a step further than that. You can then start to think about, okay, how can we design games to maybe start engendering dialogue? And on the left, we have what I would tend to call an edgy game. So when people talk about games, they might talk about climate change, they might do something like this. I should note that I have copyrighted this climate change bingo, so please, everybody, Illingworth 2020 for this. But Paul and I got a bit frustrated because we're quite big gamers ourselves. We spend a lot of time playing games, and we wanted to create games and design games that people wanted to play of their own volition, and which were ultimately fun, and that then enable people to start having dialogue, rather than something that like, oh well, this feels a bit worthy and a bit unnecessary. So on the right, you can see an expansion that Paul and I developed for the popular game Catan. For people who play games or who may be on the periphery of playing games, it's a very well-known board game. It's sold in excess of 10 million copies worldwide. And basically in it, you play a group of colonizers really who are settling an island, and you're trying to build up the largest number of resources and create the largest number of settlements. But there's no real negative consequences to that. So Paul and I developed an expansion in which we encourage players to understand that there are limited resources and that using those resources have consequences. And you can see from the bottom there, this was published in the Journal of Science Communication, and you can play that game as well. But when we design these games, it's going back to the topic of co-creation that's already been mentioned quite a lot today, and addressing the issue of the deficit model and moving towards dialogue. These are still Paul and I thinking, these are good ideas, these are the mechanics that we want to use, this is how we're going to start dialogue. Whereas actually we need to take a step back from that and think, okay, how can we work with the various audiences that we're interested in working with and actually co-create a game around their own needs and their own experiences. So that's what we did with Carbon City Zero. So this is a game that Paul and I created in collaboration with the climate charity Possible. And Possible wanted us to basically make a game that got people talking about heat decarbonisation, which is like a huge problem in the UK. But we wanted to work with various stakeholders, so activists, policymakers, school children, teachers, students, local community members, especially those who maybe have a underserved or underheard voice. So we went into these different communities, we listened to what their understandings of heat decarbonisation and the movement towards becoming a net zero economy were, and we co-created again with them. So what does that look like? Well, this involved sketching things out on pieces of paper, coming up with a rough idea for the mechanics of the game, but then asking people, what needs to be in it, what doesn't need to be in it, which cards should be more powerful than others, which cards should be less powerful than others. And this ended up being, play tested and co-created with several hundred people in the end, which resulted in Carbon City Zero, the original game, which launched last year on Kickstarter. It was fairly successful, made about £12,000, and we to about 500 copies and shipped that out worldwide. But then we got feedback again from the community saying, this is a great game, but why is it competitive? Surely if so in the game, you basically play a city mayor and you start off with quite a not very energy efficient city, and you want to try and make it become a net zero hub. But the game is competitive. You're a mayor against a mayor against a mayor. And the feedback we got was, this game is fine, but why isn't it collaborative? Surely this is much more appropriate as a collaborative game, to which Paul and I didn't actually have an answer. So we thought, well, we'd better just go and make another game. So we then made Carbon City Zero World Edition, which is here, which again successfully funded on Kickstarter, did even better this time, just short of £21,000. 693 backers, which is about 1,000 odd copies. And by listening to the community, we were able to create this game. And what was great was that this was a real co-creation process. So Paul and I, sketched out what we thought the cards could look like, but then we got an artist and a graphic designer involved as well, paid, so that we could help take our design skills as far as we could. So this is quite a nice slide because it just demonstrates the actual design development itself. So on the far left, we have the initial cards that Paul and I created when we were doing the initial play testing just to see if it worked. The next card along is one that I designed using a free piece of software called Nandeck. And then next one along again is neating that up, tidying it up. And that was the absolute limits of my design skill. The next card along on the right is then what happened when we worked with graphics designer Matt Bonner and the artist Tony Pickering. And you can see that there's a huge improvement. And then on the far right, this is the final version of the card that actually has been improved for accessibility. So part of the development of the game also involved working with various people with different accessibility needs to ensure that it met those, getting an accessibility teardown and ensuring that the game was as accessible to as many different people as possible. So these games are actually completely available to play for free online. So there's a great website called P&P Arcade, which just stands for print and play. So if you go to P&P Arcade and look for Catan Global Warming or Carbon City Zero or Carbon City Zero World Edition, you can print and play it at home. So you can just download the PDFs, print it out and play it. And you can also play it online at Tabletopia, which is an online board games arena. You can play it for free there as well. But if you'd also like to get hold of a copy of the game, just get in contact with me, because what we're really interested in doing now is in taking these games back into the communities that we initially started working with to see to what extent they are enabling us to further develop dialogue. They've been really successful in enabling us to listen to these needs, listen to these experiences, and to create a game that enables people to think through what it might look like to become a net zero economy. But we need to do even more work to then see, okay, to what extent are these games truly engendering and facilitating dialogue to take place? So if you've got any questions about this, please just find me, my email address online, connect with me on Twitter, and yeah, that's Carbon City Zero. So very happy to take any questions, and thank you very much for your time.
Excellent, thanks Sam for that really interesting talk. Has anyone got any questions?
I'll stop screen sharing now. Okay, just to answer Carl, I was being slightly facetious with the comment about jargon bingo, which I think you are as well. Like that was an illustrative purpose, just to say that when, you know, edgy games or educational games, when we think about edgy games, they're normally designed by people who don't actually play games themselves and involve one of two things, either some form of bingo or some form of a Monopoly reskin. Monopoly is one of the world's greatest evils. It's just a terrible game. Although Monopoly does serve to illustrate my point I was talking about creating a safe space very well. Because if you're playing Monopoly with someone, let's say I'm playing Monopoly with Emma, within the construct of the game, it's acceptable, in fact, encourageable for me to try and bankrupt Emma. Whereas, you know, that's obviously abhorrent behavior away from the gaming table. So that's what's amazing about games. You enter into a contract that you negotiate with your fellow players to enable you to start having these conversations that you might not normally be able to have away from the gaming table. So yeah, I know jargon bingo has been around for quite a long time, and I would strongly advise people, yes, to copyright that game as well, because obviously there's a lot of money to be made.
A monopoly, perhaps.
Very good.
Sorry. Yana, have you turned your camera on because you've got a question, or just because you're prepping for the next talk?
Sorry, I was just getting ready.
Okay, sorry. I've got a quick question for you, Sam, before we move on.
Of course.
Just how long does the process take then, from start to finish, from kind of the inception where you get that spark of an idea through to the kind of delivery, you know, having that complete package online? What are your time scales?
Well, I guess it's a very good question, Emma, and it depends to some extent on the scope of it as well. So I'm just a general point, really interested in working with any researchers who want to turn their research into games. And if you go down the design route, it's much faster. Like maybe, let's say you could go from design to getting something on Kickstarter in 7-8 months, something like that. Whereas if you're going down the co-creation route, which is something I strongly adhere to as like a practitioner in science communication and researcher there as well, you're looking more at like a year to 18 months, but then that's because it's a much larger research project. But if people are interested in thinking about how they could turn their own research into a game that's co-created by the stakeholders that they're interested in, please just drop me a line, as I'd be really happy to help with that way.
Great, yeah. Thanks. I think that's another argument for maybe embedding this kind of thing from the beginning, so you've got the time to really develop it.
Absolutely.
Jess, do you have a question at all? See, you're unmuted.
Or should I'll pick up Joanna's question in the chat. So Joanna's got, Sam, the thought of feedback on collaborative games was really interesting. Any tips on how to do this and how the game works in practice? So Joanna, collaborative games are like quite complex sometimes to make. I think the best way of doing it is playing lots of collaborative games. Just as I think with scientific research, the way we get better at research is by reading lots of papers. Like with games, the way we get better at designing games is playing lots of games. So finding collaborative games, good examples would be Forbidden Island as an entry point, Pandemic, although it's maybe a little bit on point at the moment. Dead of Winter is also a good one. Anything with zombies is normally good. And playing those games will help you to understand the mechanisms of how collaborative experiences work. Because ultimately you want to create a game where everybody's working together, but also where you avoid something called quarterbacking, which is this idea where it's a collaborative game, but one person kind of just steers everyone to do everything, like we might have in a focus group or in a workshop session with an overly loud voice dominating discussion. Really carefully and cleverly designing a game that removes some of the agency from people for such a quarterbacking situation to take place is essential, but quite a nuanced and difficult skill.
Brilliant, thanks, Sam. That's a really good consideration. I think it's time to move on now. So
thanks, everyone.
Cheers, Sam. Thanks for that really interesting talk. There's been a few more questions on the chat, maybe. If you could just answer those by typing them out,